Hey there guys, so today I want to take a look at the ROG Ally X that I picked up a couple of weeks ago, and I've been using it daily ever since. Now you might remember that I've used the ROG Ally non-X version for quite a while, but at this point I have given it to a friend and he's been using it for a few months now. But I did have that for 6 months and I used it daily within that time period. And the question that I really have is, does the ROG Ally X even have a place in 2025 with the announcement of new chips coming out for handhelds? Does this have any relevancy? And well, the simple answer is that yes, it does. The upgrades that it has over the original ROG Ally make it a far better product, though the price point might make you hesitate. The thing is, if you look at the rest of the market, it's still pretty competitive. Right off the bat, the big major upgrades over the original ROG Ally is the fact that this has a significantly increased battery life due to the fact that it went from having a 40 milliamp hour battery all the way up to an 80 milliamp hour battery. So effectively you have doubled the battery life of this handheld, and that's great to see because the original ROG Ally suffered because of the fact that if you were using the highest TDP setting, that battery life was going to get drained very quickly. We are looking at about 2 hours of real use before it gets down low enough that you probably won't be risking playing anything and having it die on you. Of course, that is at the highest TDP setting, and you could go down to 15 watts or 10 watts if you wanted to extend the battery life, but depending on the type of game that you were playing, that might just not be an option. So the improved battery life here is pretty significant. It's to the point where if you're gaming at the lower TDPs, and this time around the TDPs have been changed, instead of having a 10 watt TDP at the bottom end, it is 13 watts, then it goes up to 17 watts, which is an increase over 15 watts, and then the top end is 25 watts, same as the original ROG Ally, and also if you plug it in, you can go all the way up to 30 watts, similar to the original ROG Ally. So it's really the middle and bottom end of the TDP where there's any kind of change. And I think that this is a welcome one because it's utilizing that extra battery life to give you just a bit more performance, and at these lower TDPs that does make a difference because we are talking about 8 cores on the CPU and 12 cores on the GPU having to share that low TDP. Of course, with the CPU, you're not playing a game that's using all 8 cores, but on the GPU side of things, all 12 of those cores are trying to get power. And with only 10 watts, that can be pretty limiting. Even 13 watts is pretty limiting, but it at least makes somewhat of a difference. The second upgrade to the device itself is that you go from 16 gigabytes of RAM all the way up to 24 gigabytes of RAM, and that is a welcome upgrade for all of you that are looking to replace your laptop or your PC with a handheld. Personally, I was able to use Adobe Premiere on this device perfectly fine, and that's something that I really couldn't say about the original ROG Ally. It was my biggest complaint about it, where 16 gigabytes of RAM might be perfectly fine for your gaming PC, but if you're trying to do any heavy work, especially because of the fact that the iGPU is sharing resources with the system itself, 16 gigabytes becomes very limiting. With 24 gigabytes of RAM, you now have the ability to dedicate all the way up to 8 gigabytes of RAM to the iGPU and still have 16 gigabytes of RAM left over for the system itself. This is a very nice configuration, and it's why by default that is how ASUS configures the device. But if you're trying to use this for video editing or anything like that, I would recommend that you drop that allocation from 8 gigabytes down to 4 gigabytes. Now keep in mind, with APUs, this allocation does not really affect anything in terms of performance. APUs are designed to use as much system RAM as they need for any given task. So if a game is trying to request 10 or 12 gigabytes of RAM for video memory, it will get that. The 8 gigabyte allocation is really just there to avoid any issues that you might have when trying to launch a game that for some reason is designed to check how much VRAM you have to unlock certain features. Usually textures is something that gets artificially limited this way, and some games will even outright block you from launching the game itself if you don't have a specific amount of VRAM on your system. The vast majority of games nowadays don't do that though, and really with 4 gigabytes of RAM you avoid 99.9% of those issues. It's really major outliers that end up having a requirement of 8 gigabytes, but really again that ends up leading to some scenarios where you might not be able to turn up the textures because the system thinks that you don't have a GPU that can support that. So if you're going for purely gaming, leaving 8 gigabytes of RAM allocated to the device is the best way to go. But again, if you're looking to try to replace your laptop or use this as a secondary PC that's far more mobile, allocating 4 gigabytes will still will avoid most of the troubles that you will ever run into, and you get the added benefit of having more RAM to work with when it comes to video editing, or really whatever workload you're using that might need more RAM. But those really are the only major upgrades that ended up happening here. This is really more of an iteration over the original ROG Ally versus a full generational leap, and I think that that's perfectly fine, especially when we look at what 2025 is looking like. See, we ended up seeing AMD announce their new Z series of processors, the Z2 series, at CES, but this is a lot less exciting when you really start to delve in on what exactly these chips are. See, at the top end is where the most exciting stuff is happening with the Z2 Extreme, where we're seeing an 8-core 16-thread processor, but this is based off of Zen 5 and Zen 5C. So it's going to have 3 Zen 5 cores and it's going to have 5 Zen 5C cores. Effectively, this just means that it's going to have 5 medium-sized cores, as AMD likes to call them, because they're not the same as Intel's implementation of E-cores, where they're a fundamentally different chip with no hyper-threading and a different core design. Zen 5C is just Zen 5 with less cache. But the CPU really isn't that big of a deal, at least in terms of these handhelds, since you're mostly going to be gaming that, and that's where the GPU upgrade is pretty nice, where we're going from a 12-core RDNA 3 based GPU over to a 16-core RDNA 3.5 GPU. This should come with some nice improvements in terms of performance, but all of this kind of falls apart when you realize that this is going to be in some very expensive handhelds. And that becomes very apparent when you really look into what the handheld market is looking like right now. Because the Z2, the non-extreme version this time around, is effectively just the Z1 Extreme rebranded. It's the exact same spec. It's not Zen 5. It's using Zen 4 processors, and it's using the same RDNA 3 12-core GPU that we saw with the Z1 Extreme. Effectively the exact same thing, and that becomes very apparent when you look at what handhelds are coming out, because a lot of them are still using the Z1 Extreme. Because why wait to buy any Z2 processors if you can just buy the Z1 Extreme now and start mass manufacturing whatever handheld you plan on launching within the next couple of months? And well, the only other processor that got announced is the Z2 Go, which is quite interesting if you ask me, because it does fundamentally change the design instead of just being a rebadge of an already existing APU. Because what the Z1 Extreme and the Z2 and the Z2 Extreme are is essentially already existing AMD APUs that have the AI portion of them cut off, and they are just sold as a different chip. So nothing really changes there. The Z2 Go is slightly different because it essentially takes a 6800U, a chip that already exists and has existed for a very long time, and it just cuts off 4 of the cores, leaving us with the 12-core RDNA 2 based GPU. Now this is interesting because they are taking a similar approach to the Steam Deck, where they cut down on the amount of CPU cores that it's using so that more of the TDP just gets allocated to the GPU. Now, I like this decision, and overall, I think that the Z2 Go is an interesting chip, especially if it hit a right price point, but all of this falls apart when you realize that the Z2 Go is exclusive to one Lenovo handheld, and that one Lenovo handheld is going to have multiple different tiers, and the only tier that is currently available for pre-order at Best Buy is $730 for the Z2 Go version, not the Z1 Extreme, which they're not using the Z2, they're using the Z1 Extreme for the higher tier version. And the Z2 Go version, while it does have 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1TB SSD, is only $80 less than the ROG Ally X here, that while has less RAM, has a more powerful GPU, a more powerful CPU, is more efficient because it is a newer generation of CPU core and GPU core, while also coming with a 1TB SSD. So not only are you doubling the amount of cores on the CPU, you are also seeing an overall improvement on the GPU side of things. You're not sacrificing enough RAM to make a difference when it comes to purely gaming. And if you care at all about using 32 gigabytes of RAM, why are you getting a 4-core 8-thread CPU? So the Z2 Go is looking way less interesting based off of the system that it's in. And that's really disappointing to see, because that's the the only thing we're going to see with it, this new Lenovo handheld. It's a pretty frustrating situation because I think the Z2 Go would make perfect sense on a cheaper handheld closer towards the $500 price range, and it does seem like they will be launching a version of the Go S at that price point that's going to have less RAM, which I think is ideal for a APU that is only 4 cores and 8 threads, though 24 would be the nice middle ground there, and of course it's going to have a smaller SSD. But then what about the version with the Z1 Extreme? If $730 is the price point that they're launching the Z2 Go at, then I can only imagine the Z1 Extreme version is going to be around the price point of the ROG Ally X or more expensive. At least the Z1 Extreme version of that would be more interesting since it has 32 gigabytes of RAM instead of 24, but that's going to be launching later on in the year. The only other advantage that it has is the fact that it does have a bigger display, since it has an 8-inch display instead of the 7-inch display on the ROG. But personally, I prefer having a 7-inch display over anything bigger, and that's because I think the ROG Ally X is teetering on the edge of too heavy of a device. Of course, there are other devices that are going to be launching across the board. I mean, Acer is getting in here and they are launching their own handhelds, but these are using the laptop equivalent parts, and the price points seem to be at the same price or more expensive than the ROG Ally X. And again, those are launching at the second quarter of 2025. So exact same specs that we're looking at here, maybe just more RAM, but in terms of the performance for this gaming handheld, it'll be exactly the same as the ROG Ally X. And I know Zotac was also supposed to launch their own handheld, and I don't know where that ended up going. Apparently it did launch, but I cannot for the life of me find anywhere that has it available for sale. And looking at their subreddit, it also seems like no one seems to know where to buy this thing. So overall, the state of the handheld PC market is looking a little dire in the sense that we're going to see mostly just iterative releases instead of anything groundbreaking. Because if all these new handhelds that are launching with Z1 Extremes or Z2s are still within that $700 to $800 price point or higher, then anything with the Z2 Extreme is going to be over $1,000, and I think that that's going to be pretty disastrous for a lot of people, especially when a top-end Steam Deck is around $650. And of course, the Steam Deck is a whole different beast to this because of the fact that that runs its own operating system and is really geared towards just being a handheld, while the main advantage of these Windows handheld gaming PCs is the fact that you can play games across your entire library, whether it's Steam, Epic, GOG, Game Pass, you can use it all. And while there's workarounds to get this stuff running on Steam OS, you're not going to get full compatibility with all of your games, and the performance on the original Steam Deck is starting to show its age. It really wasn't a powerhouse when it came out, but it was mostly designed to be very efficient, and that's why the Steam Deck's battery life is still pretty great. But I can completely understand why Valve is skipping out on any Steam Deck 2 conversation when it comes to any of these new APUs that got launched. They really seem to be going more towards the top end, and that's not what Valve is looking at. Valve is really looking at efficiency here, so we likely won't see them do another custom designed APU for at least another year or two. So really, I think the only competition that the ROG Ally X realistically has in the market right now is the original ROG Ally, where you're seeing about $150 discount for a smaller battery that it is half the capacity and 8 gigabytes less of RAM. And that $650 price point is looking a lot less attractive because of that, but I do think that with the original ROG Ally, going down the open box route is not a bad move. I did pick up both the original ROG Ally and the Ally X open boxed from Best Buy, and both of them have been absolutely perfect. So while the version of the ROG Ally X that I have is $800 brand new, I paid only $650. But when I bought the ROG Ally, I also only paid $467. And at that price point, it becomes a lot more of an attractive option. So I will say this, if you're in the market for a handheld mini PC right now, I think that both the ROG Ally and ROG Ally X are the most complete package systems that you can pick up right now. Yes, there are other handheld manufacturers out there like Aya Neo, 1X Player, and GPD, but all of these companies are making handhelds that are pretty expensive in price, though they do offer their own unique features. But those are a lot more niche than something like the ROG Ally, where you can just walk into Best Buy and pick up immediately. And it comes out at a price point that is a lot more realistic for people to spend money on. And if all you care about is the gaming aspect of it, the ROG Ally is a lot more interesting because of the price point that you can get it at open boxed. But I do think that the ROG Ally X's increased battery life does make it a very nice alternative. If you are looking to buy these systems brand new, maybe spend the extra $150 to get that better battery life, because it's realistically going to make a major difference. The RAM is going to be less important unless you're someone like me that is essentially looking to use this as a laptop replacement. But if that is the scenario that you're in, well, suddenly $800 doesn't really seem like that big of a deal, considering the fact that you're getting not just a handheld, but you're also getting a very functional workstation PC. I mean, it does have a 8-core Zen 4 processor. It has 24 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD to work with. It's pretty rock solid. And the best part is you can buy it today. You don't need to wait until Q2. You don't need to wait until some arbitrary release date. It is available today. So I think that the ROG Ally X is going to hold up pretty well in 2025. Especially considering that most of the other companies that are coming into the space right now are looking to match its price or even exceed it. And that already is going to be a deal breaker for a lot of us. And if you're wondering how the Z1 Extreme holds up in 2025, I'm going to be doing a dedicated video showing a bunch of brand new titles running on the handheld. But keep in mind that the Z1 Extreme is the Z2, so whatever games that you see coming out that are optimized for handhelds are optimizing for the Z1 Extreme and the Z2. But anyways, I'll catch you guys in the next one.